He had nothing. No family, no food, not even a name worth speaking. But when Gideon Nash found the bleeding girl collapsed in the snow, he made a choice that would bring 30 armed warriors to his doorstep. This is the story of how a simple act of kindness could either get him killed or make him a legend. The wind that scoured the high plains of the Montana Territory had no name for mercy. It was a physical thing, a blade of pure cold that cut through Gideon Nash's thin coat and gnawed at the deeper chill in his bones. He was 17, a boy made old by hardship and young by hunger. To the vast, indifferent landscape, he was a ghost, a flicker of life in a world that had long since forgotten him. He owned nothing but the threadbare clothes on his back, a worn skinning knife whose handle was smooth as river stone from use, and a stubborn refusal to die that was more instinct than choice. His past was a room with a bolted door. He never tried the handle. His present was a relentless calculation for survival, measured in the fading light and the growing ache in his belly. You could know the boy by his actions. He did not walk. He drifted his eyes constantly scanning, reading the language of the land. He saw the faint depression in the snow that meant a rabbit had passed hours ago, its trail already being erased by the patient wind. He found shelter not in a cabin or a camp, but in the lee of a granite outcropping, a space just large enough to curl into to borrow a bit of the earth's stoicism against the biting air. He moved with a quiet reverence, a deference to the world that was trying to kill him. When he found a patch of shriveled, frozen berries clinging to a thorny bush, he did not devour them. He picked them one by one, his fingers clumsy with cold, and ate them slowly, as if each small burst of tartness was a sacrament. This was not just survival. It was a kind of vigil. He was a silent witness to a world that had cast him out, and his silence had become a fortress, a wall built against the kind of loneliness that could hollow a man out faster than any winter. He carried the names of his parents like cold stones in his gut, but the memories attached to them were thin as smoke. A fever, a wagon, the smell of damp earth. That was all. The world had taken them, and then it had taken everything else. Now he was just Gideon, a name that meant nothing to anyone, least of all to himself. It was just a sound as meaningless as the howl of the wind. He spent his days tracking game he had no hope of killing. A deer, a herd of pronghorn, they were too swift, too vital. He had no rifle, no bow. But he followed their tracks anyway, drawn by the simple, undeniable proof of other living things. To follow was to feel a connection, however thin. It was a way of reminding himself that he was not the only warm thing left in this frozen world. He wasn't hunting for meat. He was hunting for a reason. As the sun began its retreat, painting the western sky in bruises of purple and orange, Gideon knew the temperature would drop with a killer's speed. He needed a better shelter, a place where the wind couldn't find him. He crested a low ridge, his breath pluming before him, and looked down into a shallow wooded basin. It was there against the growing twilight that he saw it. A break in the pattern. A single dark shape huddled at the base of a snow-laden pine. It wasn't an animal. It was too still, too final. Something in him, the part that had learned to fear the stillness of the world, told him to turn back, to disappear into the gloom. But another part, the part that still followed the tracks of deer for the simple memory of life, drew him forward, one cautious, sinking step at a time. The deer tracks were a faint promise Gideon followed out of habit, not hope. He moved through the hushed woods, his own footsteps a soft crunch in the deep powder, a sound that seemed too loud in the cathedral of winter. It was then that he saw it, a flaw in the world's perfect white canvas. 50 yards ahead, a smear of crimson lay stark against a snowdrift, a wound in the landscape itself. The color was obscene in its vibrancy, a violent shout in the immense quiet. His survival instinct honed sharp as his skinning knife screamed at him. Blood meant predators 2-legged or 4. It meant trouble he could not afford. For a long moment he was frozen, a shadow caught between the urge to flee and a deeper, more dangerous curiosity. He moved forward his steps, slow, deliberate, every sense straining. She was crumpled at the base of the drift, looking like a piece of discarded buckskin. A girl no older than he was, her black hair a stark spill against the snow. She was native, dressed in clothes that spoke of a life far from his own finely worked hide, decorated with intricate quill work, now torn and stained dark, where the blood had seeped through. Her face was turned away from him, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought she was a corpse, another testament to the land's casual cruelty. Every rational thought he possessed formed a single word: run. A wounded native was not a person. She was a consequence. She was the harbinger of warriors with grim faces and sharp lances. She was the beginning of a story that did not end well for a lone white boy with nothing to his name. To be found here with her would be a death sentence. There would be no trial, no questions, only a swift and brutal misunderstanding. He could feel the phantom weight of their eyes on him, already the cold judgment. He took a half step back, the snow crunching under his heel like a warning. But then a small puff of white vapor escaped her lips, a fragile cloud in the frigid air. He stopped. His gaze fell upon her face, and the world narrowed to that single desperate detail. He saw the delicate, almost translucent skin of her eyelids, laced with veins of faint blue. He saw the barest flutter of her breath, a tiny rebellion against the crushing weight of the cold. In that instant, she was not a native, not a danger, not a consequence. She was a life as precarious and as stubborn as his own. He saw not a threat, but a reflection. The world had forgotten her just as it had forgotten him. The earth doesn't care how small you are. The choice was made. It wasn't a thought, not a weighing of odds. It was an instinct deeper than fear, a quiet pull of kinship for another soul clinging to the edge. He knelt beside her, his movements sure and economical. Her buckskin tunic was torn at the side, the wound beneath a ragged gash ugly and deep. It was not the clean work of an animal. This was the work of a man's blade, wielded with contempt. Gideon slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-boned fragility that sent a pang of something fierce and protective through him. As he lifted her, the weight settled into him, and it was two things at once. It was a burden that strained his hungry muscles and promised nothing but peril, and it was an anchor, the first solid thing he had held in a lifetime of drifting. He turned his back on the open ground on the path of escape and carried her into the deeper woods, his own survival, now irrevocably tied to hers. He didn't know her name, but he knew the rhythm of her breathing, and for now that was enough. He found a shallow cave clawed out of a rock face by an ancient wind, a mere overhang that offered little more than a break from the relentless air. Gideon laid her down gently on a bed of pine boughs. He gathered his movements efficient and quiet. With the skill of a boy who knew cold was a patient hunter, he coaxed a small, nearly smokeless fire to life in the sheltered hollow of the cave. The tiny flames were a fragile defiance, a speck of warmth in a world of ice. The girl whose name he did not know woke in fits and starts dragged from the depths by waves of pain. Her eyes, dark and wide with fever, flickered open and landed on him. Fear, sharp and animal, flashed across her face. She saw not a boy, but a white man, and the specter of that category held all the menace she had ever known. Her hand, trembling, went not to the gash in her side, but to her throat, a gesture of a deeper, more profound wound. Gideon did not speak. Words were a currency he didn't possess, and one she would not trust. Here in this bubble of desperation, only actions held any truth. He moved to the mouth of the cave and filled his battered tin cup with clean snow. Holding it over the small fire, he melted it, the water hissing as it touched the hot metal. He knelt near her, not too close, and extended the cup. His eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. He did not ask. He offered. After a long moment, her gaze flickered from his face to the cup, and she accepted, her fingers brushing his as she took it. He tore a clean strip from the bottom of his own thin shirt, a sacrifice of warmth he could ill afford. He dipped the cloth in the warm water, and with a touch that was surprisingly gentle began to clean the edges of her wound. She flinched a sharp intake of breath, but did not pull away. She watched his face, searching for the cruelty she expected to find there. She found nothing. Only a grim focus, a practical care that was more comforting than any soft word would have been. His own hunger was a gnawing beast in his stomach, but he reached into the small pouch at his belt and pulled out the last of his scavenged jerky. It was tough, barely edible, but it was all he had. He laid a piece on a flat stone near her hand. He did not watch to see if she took it. The offering was made without condition. They existed that way for hours as the sun died and the long frozen night took hold. They were 2 points of wary silence in the vast emptiness. He was assessing the danger she represented, the inevitable arrival of her people. She was assessing him, the boy who did not fit the shape of the monsters from her memory. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a silence carved from different kinds of survival, a shared language of endurance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the warmth from the fire began to do more than hold the cold at bay. It began to thaw the fear that had frozen the air between them. He was no longer just a white man, and she was no longer just a native. They were 2 breathing creatures sharing a fire, each a witness to the other's stubborn hold on life. He saw the tension ease from her shoulders. She saw him add another piece of wood to the fire, a silent promise to keep it burning through the night. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was the beginning of a truce. Dawn arrived not as a sunrise, but as a slow leaking of gray light into the world. The fever had broken. The girl he still didn't know her name, calling her Ayana in the quiet of his own mind, a name he'd once heard that meant peaceful river, was lucid. Her dark eyes, clear of the fever's haze, followed him as he moved about the small cave. She watched as he meticulously mended the sole of his worn boot, punching new holes with the tip of his knife and stitching it with a piece of dried sinew he'd saved for months. His focus was absolute, his hands steady. It was the work of a boy who knew that a failed boot meant a failed life. She spoke, her voice a low rasp. A few words in her native tongue, a question that hung in the air between them, beautiful and incomprehensible. Gideon paused his work, looking at her. He offered a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He did not understand. With a grimace of effort, she pushed herself up, leaning against the cold rock wall. Her hand went to a small beaded pouch at her belt, one he hadn't noticed before. She fumbled with the drawstring, her fingers still weak. After a moment, she drew something out and held it in her open palm. It was a river stone worn smooth by 1,000 years of current, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. It was dark gray, but its surface was alive with an intricate carving of a hawk in full flight, its wings spread wide, its eyes sharp and knowing. The detail was breathtaking. It was not a trinket. It was a piece of a soul. She held it out to him. Gideon hesitated, his hands stained with the grime of his work. She insisted, pushing her hand closer. He wiped his fingers on his trousers and gently took the stone. It was cool to the touch, its weight a surprising solid presence in his empty hand. The polished surface felt alive against his calloused skin. Ayanna. She said, her voice stronger now. She touched her chest. Then she pointed at him. He understood. It was her name. A gift. Gideon. He replied, the sound of his own name feeling foreign on his tongue. She pressed his fingers closed around the hawk stone. It was not payment. Her eyes were clear on this point. It was something more. It was a testament. A bond. In a world where Gideon had nothing to hold on to, this stone was a sudden, undeniable truth. Then, using a mix of gestures and a few broken English words she must have learned from a trader, she began to tell him her story. Her words were halting, but her meaning was sharp as broken glass. 2 men. She said, her voice laced with a venom that chilled him. She held up 2 fingers. Beards, like tangled wire. She made a motion of scraggly hair around her chin. They had ambushed her. They wanted her horse a fine Appaloosa with a spirit like fire. But their cruelty did not end with theft. She touched the wound in her side, her eyes going dark with the memory. Then she touched her throat again, the same gesture from the night before. And he understood. They had meant to silence her for good. The stone in his hand grew heavier. It was not just a gift, it was trust. And with that trust, she had given him the weight of her story, the burden of her truth. He was no longer just a boy who had found a wounded girl. He was a witness. He looked from the stone to her face, and he saw the fierce defiance burning in her eyes, a fire that even the bitter Montana winter could not extinguish. The fragile truce inside the cave was shattered by a change in the world outside. It wasn't a sound. It was a sudden, unnerving weight in the air, a stillness that was more menacing than any noise. The fire needed more wood. Gideon rose and stepped out from under the rock overhang his eyes, adjusting to the flat gray light of midday, and he froze. His world, which for a day had consisted of a fire and a wounded girl, had just expanded to include 30 silent men on horseback. They had formed a perfect, unbroken circle around the rock formation, their ponies stamping restlessly in the deep snow, their breath misting in the frigid air. They were warriors, their faces grim and unreadable as the stone around them. There was no war paint, no ceremony. There was only the cold, coiled fury of men who had found what they were searching for. Their lances, tipped with sharp, dark points, were held loosely ready. Their collective gaze was a physical force pinning Gideon to the spot. This was the moment his fear had promised him. The bill for his single act of kindness had come due. As if obeying a silent command, the warriors dismounted in a single fluid motion. Their movements were economical, deadly, the practiced grace of men whose lives were lived on the edge of a blade. They began to close the circle on foot, their moccasins making no sound on the snow. The silence was absolute, more terrifying than any war cry. One warrior, taller than the rest with shoulders as broad as a small boulder, broke from the circle and strode toward him. He had a face that looked like it was carved from granite, and his eyes were chips of black obsidian, hard and depthless. He moved with the predatory confidence of a wolf, and in his hand he held a long, bone-handled knife. This warrior stopped a few feet from Gideon, his presence a wall of contained violence. His gaze swept over Gideon's thin frame, his worn clothes, his pale face, and his eyes narrowed with a cold, certain judgment. He believed he had found his sister's killer. "Where is she?" The warrior demanded, his voice a low growl. The words were in his own tongue, but the meaning was brutally clear. Gideon didn't move. He didn't speak. There were no words that would save him now. He had trespassed, he had interfered, and now he stood at the heart of their grief and their rage. The stone in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. The warrior took another step forward, raising the knife. This was Kyle Ayana's brother, and he had come to collect a debt of blood. Gideon closed his eyes, a strange calm settling over him. He had been running from the end for so long, and now that it was here, it felt almost like relief. Before the knife could fall, Kale surged forward, his movement a blur of buckskin and rage. He grabbed Gideon by the front of his thin coat, his grip like a vice lifting the boy half off his feet. He snarled a torrent of questions, his face inches from Gideon's, the words a spray of angry incomprehension. Gideon hung there limp. He did not fight back. It was as pointless as fighting the wind. His body was a feather in a hurricane, and all he could do was wait for it to be torn apart. With his free hand, the one not clenched in Kale's coat, Gideon slowly, deliberately opened his palm. Resting there stark against his grimy skin was the carved stone. The hawk caught in its eternal flight seemed to stare up at the gray sky. Kale's tirade faltered. His eyes, burning with hate, dropped to Gideon's hand. The anger in his face flickered, replaced by a momentary confusion. He recognized the stone. His gaze snapped back to Gideon's, a new, sharper question in them now. "Kyle." The voice was weak, little more than a whisper, but it cut through the thick tension like a razor. Every warrior turned. Gideon turned. Kyle turned his grip on Gideon, not loosening, but his attention wholly diverted. Ayana stood at the mouth of the cave, leaning heavily against the rock wall. She was pale, her frame fragile, but her eyes held a fire that belied her weakness. She looked at her brother, at the white boy caught in his grip, and her expression hardened. She said his name again, this time with a sharp note of command that made the big warrior flinch. She began to speak, her voice gaining strength with each word. She spoke in her own tongue, a river of sound that flowed around Gideon, but he understood its current. The hard, accusing faces of the warriors began to soften as they looked at her, their relief a palpable thing. The cold fury in their eyes thawed, replaced by a deep, communal concern. Ayana's story poured out of her. It was a story told not just with words, but with her whole body. She pointed a trembling finger at Gideon. Then she said a single word in her language, a word that sounded like save. She pointed to her own bandaged side, then back to the boy. Then her expression turned to stone. She held up two fingers, and made a gesture of scraggly beards around her chin, her eyes flashing with a cold, pure hatred. She mimicked the act of a knife thrusting not at Gideon, but away from him toward the open plains. The warriors' gazes shifted as one. They were no longer looking at Gideon. They were looking past him, their eyes scanning the empty horizon, their rage finding a new and rightful target. The enemy was not here. The enemy was out there. Cale slowly, reluctantly released his grip on Gideon's coat. The boy dropped to his feet, a quiet gasp of air returning to his lungs. He did not move. He stood his ground, meeting the big warrior's gaze. The hatred was gone from Cale's eyes, but what remained was just as heavy doubt. A deep, unsettling suspicion. His sister's word was law, but his eyes told him a different story. A white boy found with his wounded sister. The math of the frontier was simple, and it rarely added up to innocence. He grunted something at Gideon, a dismissal, and turned away to help his sister, the other warriors closing in to offer their support. Gideon was left standing alone, no longer a condemned man, but something almost worse. An anomaly. A question that had not yet been answered. He was outside the circle of their grief and their relief, a ghost once more watching them, his hand still closed tight around the impossible weight of the carved stone. That night, a proper camp was made. The warriors, with practiced efficiency, erected temporary shelters and built a large, roaring fire that pushed back the oppressive dark and filled the small basin with a dancing golden light. Gideon sat on the edge of the circle, an island in a sea of foreign words and customs. He was given a piece of roasted rabbit, a gesture of thanks that felt more like a formal decree than an act of warmth. He ate slowly, his eyes on the fire. Ayana, her wound cleaned and properly dressed by the tribe's shaman, an old man with eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone, sat propped against a stack of furs near the fire's heart. Her father, Chief Takakota, a man whose quiet dignity was a force of nature in itself, sat beside her. When she was ready, she began to tell the full story. The men who attacked her were trappers. She knew their kind. Men who moved through the world like a plague, taking what they wanted and leaving misery in their wake. They were known in the territory, their reputations whispered in trading posts and around lonely campfires. From a snatch of conversation she'd overheard before they attacked, she gave them names Silas and Jed. As she spoke, the mood of the camp transformed. The general suspicion the warriors held for all white men began to coalesce, to harden and sharpen into a singular, focused point of rage. This was no longer an abstract grievance against an encroaching world. It was a personal vendetta. Silas and Jed. The names were passed from man to man, murmured like a curse. Ayana's voice grew stronger, fueled by the telling. She described how they were not just horse thieves. They were men who killed for the sport of it, whose eyes held a deadness that was more terrifying than any animal's fury. She spoke of their laughter as they rode away, leaving her bleeding in the snow. A cruel, careless sound that had echoed in the silent woods. The laughter followed her like dust. That detail landed like a physical blow. The warriors who had been listening with grim patience now gripped their weapons tighter. The sound of that laughter was an insult that went deeper than the wound in Ayana's side. It was a desecration of the land of their honor. The shaman, who had been listening with his eyes closed, finally spoke. His voice was low like the rumbling of distant thunder. He declared that the spirits of Silas and Jed were stained their actions an offense against the balance of the world. An unclean presence had been left on their land, and it must be cleansed. The hunt was no longer just for revenge. It had become a sacred duty. It was for justice. Chief Takakota placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, his face a mask of sorrow and iron resolve. He looked across the fire, his eyes finding Gideon in the shadows. For the first time, the chief's gaze held something other than wary assessment. It held a flicker of shared purpose. The fire crackled spitting embers into the night sky, each one a tiny burning star of vengeance. The hunt would begin at dawn. Before the camp settled into sleep, Chief Takakota approached Gideon. The chief's movements were deliberate, his presence radiating a quiet authority that needed no words. He stood before Gideon, his face a map of wisdom and deep sorrow, and through Cale, who translated with a grudging stiffness, he made his offer. Gideon's part in this was done. The debt for his kindness had been acknowledged. He would be given a horse, a good one, and enough food to last him a week. He was free to ride away to disappear back into the wilderness from which he came. No one would stop him. It was a fair offer, a generous one. It was a chance to reclaim the anonymity that had until now been his only shield. He could be a ghost again. He could be free of the weight of their hunt, of the burning anger in their eyes, of the story he had stumbled into. He could go back to his life of minute-by-minute survival, a life of profound loneliness, but also one of profound simplicity. All he had to do was say yes. But as he looked past the chief, he saw the faces of the warriors around the fire. He saw the grim set of their jaws, the iron resolve in their eyes. He thought of Ayana's voice laced with venom as she described the cruel laughter of Silas and Jed. He had seen the tracks those men had left when he first found her, a careless disregard for the land, the kind of arrogance that came from men who believed the world belonged to them. He knew how men like that thought, how they moved. Men who lived by taking and destroying had a predictable kind of cowardice. They would run, but they would run toward what they thought was safety. To leave now would be like leaving a story half read. It would be an act of cowardice his own soul would not forgive. He had been a witness, and that came with a burden. The stone in his pocket felt warm, a silent reminder of the bond he had accepted. He was no longer just a drifter. He was a part of this, whether he wanted to be or not. He met Chief Takakota's gaze, a flicker of something new, resolve hardening his own features. He spoke, his voice quiet but clear, carrying across the crackling fire. He didn't need the translator. His meaning would be plain. They'll head for the pass at Crow's Landing. He said the words surprising even himself with their certainty. It's the fastest way out of these mountains if you're looking to sell a stolen horse and disappear. He paused, letting the weight of his knowledge settle in the cold air. I can show you. Kyle's eyes widened slightly, his expression a mixture of shock and renewed suspicion. Chief Takakota's face remained impassive, but a flicker of interest stirred in his deep-set eyes. Gideon had just made a choice. It was not a choice for survival, but for something more. He had chosen compassion over comfort, involvement over escape. And in doing so without knowing it, he had just chosen to become more than a ghost. He had chosen to become a man. Riding with the war party was like being a lone gray wolf in a pack of red ones. Gideon was an anomaly, a disruption to their natural order. He rode the horse they gave him a steady bay, and kept to himself a silence among their low, urgent conversations. He was constantly being tested. His worth was not inherent. It had to be proven moment by moment in the crucible of their hunt. Kyle rode beside him, a constant, brooding presence. His watchfulness was a physical weight, his doubt a palpable thing. He did not speak to Gideon, but he watched everything the boy did. He watched how he handled his horse, how he scanned the horizon, how he rationed the water in his canteen. Every action was a line in a ledger tallied against a debt of suspicion. They tested his knowledge of the terrain, asking him through gestures about trails and water sources. Gideon, who had spent years living like a shadow on this land, knew its secrets intimately. He knew the hidden springs that never froze, the game trails that were invisible to the untrained eye, the canyons that echoed, and the ones that swallowed sound whole. He would point his answers short and certain, and they would find he spoke the truth. They tested his tracking skills. The warriors were masters, their eyes trained to read the land like a book. But Gideon read it differently. They saw the tracks of a whole animal. He saw the broken twig, the dislodged pebble, the scrape of an iron horseshoe on stone, where a moccasin would have left no trace. He had the outsider's eye, the perspective of one who had learned to survive on the leavings of others. In a patch of stony ground, where the warriors had lost the trail, Gideon dismounted. He knelt his fingers, brushing the cold rock, and pointed to a faint, dark scratch. "Iron," he said, the single word carrying the weight of his certainty. Kyle grunted a sound of grudging acknowledgement. They had missed it. He moved through the forest with a ghost's tread, a habit born of a lifetime of avoiding notice. He did not boast. He did not offer his knowledge until it was needed. He proved his worth not with words, but with quiet, irrefutable competence. Slowly the atmosphere began to shift. It was not friendship he was earning, but something harder, something more valuable in this unforgiving world, a grudging, hard-won respect. He began to learn their rhythms, the silent language of their hunt. A raised hand, a low whistle, a particular glance, each held a specific meaning. He learned to anticipate their movements, to understand the flow of their collective purpose. And they in turn began to learn to trust the quiet white boy who saw the world through a different lens. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a tool, a strange and unexpected one, but a useful one nonetheless. And in this land, what was useful was allowed to survive. They tracked them for 2 days, the trail growing fresher, the signs of their passage more careless. Silas and Jed believed they were safe, their arrogance leaving a clear path for the vengeance that followed. The warriors cornered them at the edge of the Sun River, a fast, churning ribbon of gray water that cut through the high country. The trappers were caught in the open, trying to ford the treacherous current. Chaos erupted. The warriors descended, their pent-up fury unleashed in a swift, brutal attack. Silas and Jed were not soldiers. They were feral fighters, cornered rats who fought with a desperate, snarling viciousness. A brief, bloody skirmish exploded on the riverbank, a whirlwind of flashing knives, swinging rifles, and the guttural shouts of men locked in mortal combat. Gideon stayed back, his role as a guide, finished his presence in a fight useless. He watched from the cover of the pines, his heart hammering against his ribs. For the first time, he got a clear look at the 2 men. They were exactly as Ayanna had described, big, filthy men with beards like tangled nests of wire and eyes that were small and mean. In the confusion, Silas and Jed managed to fight their way to the opposite bank, scrambling up the muddy slope and disappearing into the thick timber. 2 warriors lay wounded, and the air was thick with the scent of blood and frustration. They had escaped. As the warriors tended to their own, Gideon walked the site of the skirmish. The ground was churned to mud, littered with spent cartridges and drops of blood. His eye, trained to see the things others missed, caught a glint of metal half buried in the mire near the river's edge. He knelt and pulled it free. It was a skinning knife, but unlike any he had ever seen. The blade was heavy, well-made steel. The handle was what caught his breath. It was dark, polished wood, but inlaid with a fine silver wire that formed the image of a coiled snake, its tiny eyes 2 chips of glittering black stone. It was an expensive, ornate thing, a blade that spoke of pride and wealth, not the rough utility of a common trapper. He was holding it, wiping the mud from the silver inlay, when Kyle approached. The big warrior's face was a thundercloud of rage at their failure. He saw the knife in Gideon's hand and stopped dead. His eyes widened, and he snatched it from Gideon's grasp. Kyle turned the knife over and over, his expression shifting from anger to a dawning, horrified recognition. "Hayes!" He breathed the name, a harsh whisper. He looked at Gideon, his suspicion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a new, darker certainty. He spoke quickly to the other warriors, his voice low and urgent. He held up the blade for all to see. A murmur went through the group. They knew the knife. Through a younger warrior who knew a little more English than the others, Gideon pieced together the story. The knife had belonged to a prospector, a man named Elias Hayes. He had been a friend to their tribe, a rare white man who treated them with fairness and respect, trading honestly for supplies. He had vanished near these mountains 2 months ago. They had searched, but found no sign. Now they had one. The crime was no longer just an assault. It was not just horse theft. It was murder. Silas and Jed were not just brutes. They were thieves who had killed a good man for his belongings. The dropped blade was not just a knife. It was hard proof. It was a piece of truth that would change everything, turning a quest for vengeance into a demand for a deeper, more absolute justice. The hunt was far from over. As the war party regrouped on the riverbank, their fury now cold and hard, as the stones beneath their feet, a new threat appeared on the horizon. It was a slow-moving line of dark blue against the pale sky, a color that signaled a different kind of danger. A U.S. cavalry patrol. A dozen men on tired horses, their uniforms dusty, their faces grim with the boredom and authority of their post. Gideon's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Peace in this territory was as fragile as morning frost, and the sight of an armed war party fresh from a fight was a spark in a tinder-dry forest. The patrol was led by a captain with a sharp jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky. Captain Whitman Gideon would later learn was a man who saw the world in simple, clean lines, order and chaos, law and savagery. He had his orders dispatched from a fort 100 miles away to quell reports of Indian hostilities in the area. And what he saw before him fit that report perfectly. He saw 30 warriors, their weapons still bearing the signs of recent battle. He saw 2 of their own being tended for wounds. And most damningly, he saw a lone white boy in their midst, looking thin and lost as a ghost. His training and his prejudice provided a simple, deadly interpretation of the scene. Gideon was a captive, or worse, a renegade, who had turned his back on his own kind. Neither conclusion offered a path to a long life. The cavalry advanced their movements, practiced and deliberate. They fanned out into a skirmish line, their carbines held ready across their saddles. Their arrival was an intrusion of a different world, a world of bugle calls and regulations, a world that had no language for the kind of justice the warriors sought. Captain Whitman rode forward, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. "Hold your position," he called out, his voice sharp and clear, a sound that sliced through the natural quiet of the river valley. Kyle stepped forward to meet him, his own hand gripping the handle of his knife. The two men faced each other across a chasm of culture and history, each the embodiment of a world the other could not understand. A hunt for justice was about to become a prelude to a massacre. Whitman's gaze flickered to Gideon, his eyes narrowing. "You boy, are you a prisoner?" Before Gideon could answer, before he could find the words to bridge the impossible gap between these two forces, Cale grunted a sharp command. The warriors behind him raised their lances as one, a silent, deadly promise of what was to come. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of impending violence. Gideon stood between them, a fragile thread, in a world that was about to tear itself apart. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Captain Whitman, using a nervous-looking scout as a reluctant translator, issued his demands. His voice was clipped, impatient. The white captive was to be released immediately. The war party was to disarm and disperse. They were orders, not requests. Cale's response was a low growl of refusal. His hand tightened on the shaft of his lance. His people were hunting murderers, men who had violated his sister and killed a friend. He would not be stopped by men in blue coats who had never cared for their laws or their losses. To him, Whitman's demands were just another form of the same arrogance that had led Silas and Jed to their crimes. Gideon stood in the no-man's land between them, a boy caught between two armies, two worlds, two immovable forces of pride and certainty. He saw the flinty righteousness in Captain Whitman's eyes, the cold belief that he was the sole arbiter of order in this chaotic land. He saw the unbending grief and fury in Cale's posture, the refusal to yield an inch of his people's right to justice. If someone didn't speak, this riverbank would be soaked in blood. He had to become the bridge. Summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, Gideon took a step forward into the center of the standoff. He held his empty hands up, palms out, a universal sign of peace in a world that had so little of it. He did not look at Cale. He looked directly at Captain Whitman, meeting the officer's hard gaze without flinching. "I'm not a captive, sir," he said, his voice quiet but steady, carrying clearly in the tense silence. The fear was a cold knot in his gut, but he would not let it tremble in his voice. Whitman's eyes narrowed. "Then what are you, son, a renegade?" "No, sir," Gideon said. "I'm a witness." He took a deep breath. "They aren't the enemy. The enemy is the men we're hunting." His words hung in the air, a simple statement of a truth that was far too complex for this place and time. The scout translated Gideon's words for Cale, whose expression of stony rage did not change. To Whitman, Gideon's claim was suspect, the ramblings of a boy who had been in the wilderness too long. But to Gideon, it was the only truth that mattered. He had chosen his side not based on the color of a man's skin, but on the content of his actions. And he would stand by that choice even if it was the last one he ever made. He had to make them see. He had to build a bridge of words over this chasm of hate, or watch them all fall in. Captain Whitman was dismissive, his face a mask of stern impatience. He saw a boy likely coerced or bewitched spouting nonsense to protect his captors. "Son," You're either a captive or a traitor. He said, his voice flat and final. It's my job to find out which, and I plan to do it back at Fort Benton. Now step aside. Gideon knew he had only one chance, a single moment before the brittle peace shattered completely. Words were not enough. He needed proof. He reached into his coat, and his hand closed around the heavy, ornate knife Kyle had given him to hold. He pulled it out and held it up, the silver serpent on its handle catching the pale winter light. This is the proof. Gideon said, his voice ringing with a conviction that made Whitman pause. This belonged to a prospector named Elias Hayes. He registered his claim at Fort Benton 2 months back. I'd wager you have a report on him. The captain's expression flickered. A crack appeared in his wall of certainty. He did know the name. A missing persons report filed weeks ago. A loose end he had dismissed as another man swallowed by the wilderness. Gideon pressed his advantage, his words coming faster now, painting a clear and damning picture. The men you're looking for, their names are Silas and Jed. One is tall with a scar by his left eye. The other is stocky, missing 2 fingers on his right hand. They're the ones who attacked the chief's daughter. They're the ones who murdered Hayes for his gear. He wasn't just telling a story. He was presenting evidence, facts that could be verified, details that resonated with the cold logic of a crime. Whitman was a man of the law, a man who believed in order and process. And this physical proof, this serpent-handled knife, a piece from a completely different puzzle, forced him to hesitate. It complicated his simple narrative. He looked from the knife to Gideon's earnest face, then to the unyielding wall of warriors. "All right, son," Whitman said slowly, his mind working. "I'll give you this. We'll find these men, Silas and Jed." He turned his gaze to Cale, his voice hardening again. "I'll grant a truce. 24 hours. We ride together. We find these murderers, and they will face army justice." He then looked pointedly at Gideon. "But if this is a trick, if you're leading us into an ambush, my response will be swift and absolute. And every man here will pay the price." The threat was clear, the terms brutal. But it was a chance. Kyle, after a tense exchange with his own warriors, gave a curt, reluctant nod. He did not trust the blue coats, but he recognized the power they held. And he wanted Silas and Jed more than he wanted a fight with the U.S. Army. For now, a tense, fragile truce was declared on the muddy banks of the Sun River. A hunt for justice had become a race against time, with the lives of everyone present hanging on the word of a boy who had nothing to his name but the truth. The pursuit that followed was a portrait of simmering mistrust. 2 worlds forced into an uneasy alliance moved across the land in a clashing rhythm. The cavalry rode with the loud, ordered precision of their training, the jingle of their harnesses, and the thud of their horses' hooves, a constant, clumsy noise. The warriors, in stark contrast, glided through the trees like shadows, their movements fluid and silent, a part of the landscape itself. Gideon rode in the space between them, the hinge point of this fragile, temporary peace. He was the only one trusted by both sides, and trusted completely by neither. The weight of that position was immense. He found himself translating not just words, but intentions, a far more difficult and dangerous task. He rode beside Captain Whitman for a time, pointing out the subtle signs of the trapper's passage. Whitman, a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question, was impatient with the warrior's silent methods. "Why are they just sitting there?" he'd demand, pointing to a group of warriors who had stopped, their heads cocked, as if listening to the wind. "They're not just sitting, sir." Gideon would explain, his voice low and even. "They're listening. To the ground. To the birds. They say you can hear a man's haste in the silence he leaves behind. Whitman would grunt, unconvinced, but intrigued despite himself. Later, Gideon would ride with Kyle, who watched the rigid formations of the cavalry with open contempt. "They move like buffalo in a canyon," Kyle said through the young translator. "They warn every animal for a mile that they are coming." "It's their way," Gideon replied, choosing his words carefully. "Their strength is in their discipline, not their silence. Whitman's commands are not meant as disrespect. They are meant to hold his men together to make them a single weapon." Kyle's stare was hard, but he considered the boy's words. He was beginning to see that Gideon didn't just see the surface of things. He saw the shape of them underneath. It was a slow, arduous process of building a fragile understanding. Trust was not given. It was earned in inches. It was earned in a shared glance across a ravine when Gideon's tracking proved true. It was earned when a cavalry trooper offered Kyle a piece of his hardtack, a gesture that was met with a curt but not dismissive nod. It was earned in the quiet moments around the campfire at night, when the two groups kept their distance, but listened to the sounds of each other's languages, the shared human noises of men far from home. They were not friends. They were not allies in any true sense of the word. They were two opposing forces, their purposes briefly and perhaps only temporarily aligned, but for now held together by the quiet resolve of a boy who understood the language of both silence and commands. They moved as one, a strange and deadly procession, hunting two men who had managed to unite them in a common cause. Gideon's knowledge of the land, born from years of seeking its most hidden and forgotten corners, led them to a place the cavalry's maps could never show. Dead Rock Canyon was a jagged wound in the earth, a treacherous maze of shadowed ravines and crumbling stone spires that discouraged all but the most desperate or the most wicked. And it was here, nestled deep in the canyon's heart, like a spider in its web, that Silas and Jed had made their lair. It was a crude, hastily built cabin, its back pressed against a sheer cliff face, giving it a solid defense from one direction. The front of the cabin overlooked a narrow, rocky clearing offering clear lines of sight. It was a strong position chosen by men who expected trouble. While the warriors and soldiers watched from a safe distance, Coyle and Captain Whitman, with Gideon in tow, crept closer to scout the location. The place was a sty. The ground was littered with rotting animal hides, empty whiskey bottles, and the general filth of men who lived without care or consequence. But it was more than just a messy camp. It was a graveyard of other people's lives. Kyle spotted it first. A saddle tossed carelessly onto a pile of firewood, bearing the distinctive brand of a rancher from the lowlands who had been found murdered a month ago. Whitman's jaw tightened. This was no longer just about a missing prospector. It was a string of crimes, a pattern of violent theft. Then Gideon saw something else glinting in the dirt near the cabin door. He pointed, and Whitman knelt to pick it up. It was a woman's silver locket, small and heart-shaped, its chain broken. The captain pried it open with his thumbnail. Inside, the tiny portraits of a smiling woman and a small child looked up at them, their images a silent, heartbreaking accusation. This locket added another layer of sin to the trapper's ledger, a crime of personal violation that went beyond simple murder. The proof was undeniable, now a cold, hard weight in the canyon air. It was a truth that resonated with both the warriors who saw the desecration of lives and with the U.S. Army, which saw the flagrant violation of its laws. Silas and Jed were not just outlaws. They were a cancer on this land. but they were a cancer in a well-fortified position. The clearing in front of the cabin was a killing field. A direct assault, as Whitman was initially inclined to order, would be a slaughter. The trappers were cornered, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. They had rifles cover and the advantage of high ground. The uneasy alliance held its breath staring at the trappers' lair, knowing that the final bloody act of this drama was about to begin, and that not everyone would walk away. The alliance, already strained, reached a breaking point. Captain Whitman, a man of direct action, laid out a plan for a frontal assault at dawn. "We'll overwhelm them with superior firepower," he stated, his voice full of the unshakable confidence of command. Cale scoffed, the sound a low growl of derision. "You will overwhelm the rock walls with the bodies of your own men," he retorted through the translator. "They will pick you off one by one. The night is our friend. We attack under the cover of darkness like the wolf, not the lumbering bear." They were at a stalemate, two proud leaders locked in a battle of tactics and wills. Whitman saw Cale's plan as undisciplined savagery. Cale saw Whitman's as foolish suicide. They glared at each other over the flickering fire, the fate of the entire mission hanging in the balance. It was Gideon, the one with no rank, no weapon, and no voice in this council of war, who saw the third option. As the two men argued, his eyes were not on them, but on the sheer cliff face behind the cabin. He was remembering his years of scrambling through these canyons, of learning the secret paths that only the goat and the desperate ever used. He remembered a narrow game trail, little more than a goat's track, nearly invisible from below, that snaked its way up the canyon wall. A trail that would lead to a position directly above the trapper's lair. He waited for a lull in the argument, then spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through their anger. "There's another way." Both Kyle and Whitman turned to look at him, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and surprise. "There's a trail," Gideon continued, pointing toward the top of the cliff. "It leads up to that ridge, above the cabin." Whitman squinted, seeing nothing but sheer rock. "That's impossible. No man could climb that." "A man couldn't," Gideon agreed. "But a boy who's small enough and quiet enough might." He looked from Cale's dark, questioning eyes to Whitman's skeptical frown. "I can make that climb without being seen." His plan was simple, born from the cunning of a survivor. "I'll get above them. There's a pile of loose rock up there. I can start a rock slide on the west side of the cabin. It'll make a hell of a noise. It will draw their attention, make them think the attack is coming from that direction. While they're looking that way, He nodded to Cale and his warriors. "And you," he nodded to Whitman and his soldiers. "Attack from the front, together." It was a plan that relied not on brute force, but on cleverness. It was not the strategy of a soldier or a warrior. It was the strategy of the weak, of one who has learned to use the land itself as a weapon, because he has no other. For a long moment there was silence. Then Kyle gave a slow, thoughtful nod. He saw the wisdom in it. Whitman, after a moment's hesitation, also agreed. It was unorthodox, but it was better than losing half his men in a pointless charge. The fate of the battle now rested on the narrow shoulders of the boy, who had, until a few days ago, been nothing more than a shadow on the land. The climb was a grueling, terrifying ascent in the pre-dawn chill. Gideon moved up the rock face with the patient, sure-footed grace of a mountain goat, his small frame an advantage on the narrow, treacherous path. Below, the combined force of warriors and soldiers waited in the shadows, a silent, tense sea of anticipation. He reached the ridge just as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. He found the pile of loose scree he had spotted from below and set to work dislodging the key stones that held the small avalanche in check. At a signal from below, a low whistle that mimicked a night bird, Gideon gave a final desperate shove. The rock slide was not an avalanche, but it was enough. A cascade of stone and earth thundered down the western side of the canyon, the noise echoing like a cannon shot in the enclosed space. As predicted, the door of the cabin burst open, and Silas and Jed stumbled out rifles in hand, their eyes searching the western ridge for the source of the attack. In that moment of distraction, the canyon floor erupted. The warriors surged from the shadows on one side, the cavalry from the other, a pincer of silent fury and disciplined fire. The fight was brief, brutal, and decisive. Caught completely by surprise, Silas and Jed were overwhelmed before they could fire more than a few wild shots. They were captured, disarmed, and dragged into the center of the clearing, their faces a mask of shocked disbelief and snarling hatred. The truth was laid bare in the dusty canyon floor. The stolen goods, the serpent-handled knife, the broken locket, all of it was brought forth, a silent testament to their crimes. In a moment of profound, unspoken justice, Cale, holding the ornate knife, walked not to the captured men, but to Captain Whitman. He did not offer it. He presented it a transfer of evidence from one law to another. Whitman took the knife, his expression grim. He looked at the blade, then at the two trappers, and then at Kyle. He understood. He gave a curt nod. In a gesture that defied every regulation in his army manual, he stepped back, allowing Chief Takakota, who had just arrived with a small retinue, to approach the prisoners. The chief did not speak of vengeance. He spoke of balance. He declared the judgment of his people a sentence of banishment from these sacred lands, a spiritual casting out that was, in its own way, more profound than any hanging. Then he turned to Whitman. "They are yours now," he said through the translator. "Let your law have its say." Two forms of justice, so often at odds, had found a moment of shared resolution in the morning sun. The air, so recently filled with the promise of violence, was now still. Captain Whitman walked over to Gideon, who stood quietly by the edge of the clearing, a forgotten piece of the battle he had orchestrated. The captain looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not a boy, not a captive, not a renegade, but the unlikely architect of a peace he never could have forged on his own. "You did good, son." Whitman said the words simple, but carrying the full weight of a newfound respect. "You did real good." Gideon did not ride away with the cavalry. When Captain Whitman offered him a place back to the fort, a warm meal and a cot, the boy quietly refused. He chose to stay. He was brought to the tribe's winter village, a collection of sturdy lodges nestled in a valley protected from the wind, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. Here in the heart of their home, a ceremony was held. It was not a grand affair, but a quiet, solemn gathering around the central fire. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage and the low murmur of prayer. Gideon stood before Chief Takakota, feeling small and out of place, a pale thread in a rich tapestry of tradition he did not understand. The chief, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, spoke. He spoke of the broken balance of the justice that had been served and of the unexpected bridge that had been built between two worlds. He spoke of the boy who had acted not from a desire for reward, but from a simple human kindness. A boy who had proven his worth, not with words, but with courage and a quiet heart. Then Takakota gave him a new name, In our tongue. The chief said, his voice resonating with a deep power. We will call you Akando. He paused, letting the name settle. It means, he who is the bridge. Gideon Nash, the boy with nothing, the ghost on the landscape, was gone. In his place stood Akando, a name with meaning, a name with a home. Ayana, her wound healing, her eyes bright and clear, stepped forward. She held the carved hawkstone in her palm. She took Gideon's hand and placed the stone back into it. It was no longer a bond of debt, a desperate plea for help. Now it was a symbol of his place in their world, a testament to the family he had earned. The final image of the boy who was once a drifter is this. He is sitting by the central fire, a warm bowl of stew in his hands. The silence around him is not the empty silence of loneliness, but the comfortable living silence of belonging. It is punctuated by the quiet laughter of children chasing each other between the lodges, their small forms darting in and out of the firelight. He is watching them, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face. He had not found a home. He had built one. He had learned that family is not a thing you are born into, but a sanctuary you forge from courage, from loyalty, and from the quiet, stubborn, and defiant act of choosing to care when the world tells you not to. Blood leaves, but heart stays. And Akando's heart, for the first time in his life, had found a place to remain. If this story stirred something in your heart, the quiet strength of a boy who had nothing, the resilience of a girl who refused to be broken, the warmth of a home built not from wood, but from courage, then you already understand the tales we tell here. Thank you for watching Second Chance Hearts. If you believe that kindness is a choice, and that every soul deserves a place to belong, don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Hearts and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of hope from the unforgiving frontier.